Before the world knew the British Empire as a global superpower, it was a force built on conquest, extraction, and uncompromising control. For centuries, its flag stretched across continents over lands it did not own and over people who did not choose its rule. Behind the polished image of civilization and progress lay a machinery of violence, famine, forced trade, and political repression. What you're about to see are not isolated events, but repeated patterns that reveal the empire's darkest foundations. The British Empire was a vast and complex political and economic entity that at its height in the 19th and early 20th centuries controlled territories on every inhabited continent. Originating from the British Isles, this empire expanded over centuries through colonization, conquest, and trade. Its earliest formations began with overseas trading posts and colonies established in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Asia during the 16th to 18th centuries. The peoples central to its growth were a mix of British administrators, military forces, merchants, and indigenous subjects subjected to colonial rule. Geopolitically, Britain's island isolation combined with a powerful navy enabled it to dominate global maritime routes and extract resources from its colonies. This dominance established it as a global superpower, facilitating the establishment of economic systems and political structures that influenced international relations and local societies worldwide, but also engendered exploitation, conflict, and systemic violence. The year 1839 marks a critical and brutal juncture in the empire's history. The streets of Canton, China, lay shrouded in dense clouds of smoke from cannon fire and burning opium chests. British warships, steel-clad and roaring with artillery, bombarded the dilapidated city defenses as Chinese forces scrambled to hold back the assault. The air was thick with choking smoke, and the wet mud beneath soldiers' feet was stained with the blood of peasants and soldiers alike. The British enforced their economic demands with iron fists, using military power to secure the trade of a deadly narcotic. This conflict, known as the First Opium War, was not an isolated incident but a manifestation of imperial will ruthlessly applied to dismantle sovereign, resistance, and open forced markets. Disease and hunger gripped the local populace amidst the ruins, while barbed legal and trade restrictions tightened British control. This scene of violence triggered a chain of events far beyond the shores of China, echoing structural patterns of exploitation and oppression established in earlier colonial ventures. The oppressive governance systems, economic extraction, and militarized enforcement used in the Opium Wars were reflective of wider practices of the British Empire, particularly evident in the administration of India, where famine and misery would follow in the wake of imperial policies. The Bengal Famine of 1943, among other dark episodes, stands as a grim testament to the recurring cycle of economic exploitation combined with neglect and ruthless governance. Through these interconnected events, the empire's foundational priorities, profit, control, and domination, repeatedly catalyzed crises with devastating human consequences. Historical evidence highlights how these systems perpetuated suffering, revealing a persistent structural brutality at the core of British imperial rule. The Opium Wars and Bengal Famine are intertwined episodes in the larger narrative of British colonial rule, each driven by systemic prioritization of imperial economic interests over human lives. The militarized enforcement of trade regimes in China laid groundwork for repeated imperial practices, such as the control of Indian agriculture and resources that would precipitate catastrophic famines. This cyclical pattern of dominance and devastation was enforced not only through military might, but also legal and bureaucratic mechanisms that marginalized local survival needs. Such colonial governance embedded a political economy of extraction, characterized by ruthless exploitation and the suppression of resistance, creating structural vulnerabilities that repeatedly erupted into humanitarian disaster. Most lives ended unnoticed. In 1943, Bengal, a sprawling cityscape, deteriorated into ruin. Cyclones had ravaged crops, flooding the deltas. Starved masses wandered crowded, disease-filled alleys. Food prices soared beyond reach. Fishing boats confiscated as military assets rotted unused. British troops enforced a scathing denial policy, seizing grain stocks and transport, while military demands requisitioned local resources for distant battlefronts. The iron grip of imperial war priorities strangled desperate civilians, their survival crushed by bureaucratic indifference. The Bengal Famine of 1943 was not merely a natural disaster, but an engineered catastrophe, shaped by British wartime policies. Archaeological and archival evidence indicates multiple natural calamities, severe cyclone, tidal floods, and a brown spot fungus epidemic reduced Bengal's rice yield substantially. However, historical analyses emphasize that natural causes alone cannot account for the scale of starvation that ensued. Most scholars argue that British colonial governance significantly exacerbated the crisis. The Japanese occupation of Burma severed a primary rice import source, inducing scarcity. In response, British authorities implemented a scorched earth denial strategy, forcibly confiscating boats, carts, and food supplies to prevent Japanese forces from benefiting. This policy decimated local fishing and transport sectors, crucial lifelines for Bengal's subsistence economy. Research papers highlight that wartime exigencies prioritized military provisioning over civilian survival. Churchill's war cabinet deliberately diverted food stocks to British troops in the Middle East, restricting aid to Bengal despite pleas from colonial officials. Trade barriers between Indian provinces obstructed grain movement into famine zones. Price inflation outpaced the purchasing power of impoverished consumers, pushing millions beyond the brink of starvation. Historical investigation reveals administrative failures compounded the famine. Government rationing was inadequate, ineffective, and biased toward urban centers like Calcutta, leaving rural populations neglected. Bengal's food scarcity was thus a consequence of entitlement failure, the disjunction between food availability and access, rooted in imperial extraction and logistical neglect. The Bengal famine echoes earlier imperial patterns seen in the Opium Wars. Both events demonstrate how British imperial power enforced economic dominance through militarized coercion and systemic repression, subordinating native populations to capital and strategic interests. The famine cycle also mirrored colonial agricultural policies incentivizing cash crops for export while undermining food security, evident in reductions of subsistence crop production. The denial policy and resource requisition in Bengal reflected the same structural violence that opened Chinese markets with opium military campaigns. Small policy shifts toward military priorities escalated into humanitarian disaster, revealing the fragile and exploitative foundations of imperial control. Such repeated governance failures exhibit deeply rooted systemic negligence that transformed crises into prolonged catastrophes. Survival depended on endurance, not choice. April 13, 1919. Jallianwala Bagh, Amritsar. A confined garden encased by high brick walls. British soldiers, rifles raised, encircled tens of thousands gathered under the burning sun in protest. Steel barrels disgorge relentless bursts of fire into the packed crowd, where exit is blocked on three sides. Bodies collapse in waves. Blood pools in the mud. Screams are drowned by artillery echoes. No warning, no mercy. The firing continues until ammunition depletes, leaving hundreds dead, thousands wounded, and the shattered will of a people. The Amritsar Massacre, also known as the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, stands as an explicit exemplar of colonial brutality within the British Empire. On April 13, 1919, British troops, led by General Reginald Dyer, deliberately opened fire on a large, peaceful gathering of Indian civilians protesting repressive colonial laws, including the Rowlatt Acts. Primary reports and witness accounts confirm that. Dyer positioned his soldiers to block all exits, ordering them to fire indiscriminately into the crowd until they ran low on ammunition. Estimates record approximately 379 deaths and over 1,000 injuries, though numbers vary due to the chaotic aftermath. Historical analyses note that this atrocity was not an isolated incident, but a critical manifestation of the imperial divide and rule strategy aimed at crushing Indian nationalist movements. The massacre shattered any illusion of benevolent colonial governance, hardening widespread Indian resistance and fueling the independence struggle. British authorities institutionalized repression through martial law, curfews, mass arrests, punitive trials, and brutal enforcement of racial hierarchies, which deepened divisions and worsened social conditions in Punjab. Research uncovers that the massacre and subsequent pacification measures were met with silence or tacit approval within certain colonial circles, reflecting deeply ingrained attitudes of racial superiority and governance through fear. The event triggered international shock but provoked no formal British apology, only expressions of regret decades later. Its legacy shaped both Indian nationalism and British imperial policies, revealing structural patterns of state violence, militarized suppression, and disregard for colonial subjects' lives. The massacre forms part of a broader continuum of British imperial atrocities, linking to earlier events such as the Opium Wars and the Bengal Famine, where systemic policies of extraction, repression, and neglect coalesced in human suffering. Patterns re-emerged: economic exploitation paired with military enforcement, legal structures upholding racial subjugation, and political decisions prioritizing imperial control over civilian well-being. Small shifts in administration or military command repeatedly precipitated massive consequences, revealing the brittle, violent underpinnings of the empire's supposed stability. Authority existed only to be obeyed. The 16th century ironclad port, once a steaming hub of colonial trade and violence, now lies abandoned. Walls scarred by cannon fire, streets clogged with refuse and decay. The smoke of industrial furnaces long extinguished hangs in the memory of rusted rails and hollow barracks. Beneath the cracked stone, the bones of countless oppressed lie forgotten, testimony to ruthless enforcement of imperial order. The silence is absolute, a graveyard of political ambition and systemic cruelty. The British Empire's darkest secrets cannot be isolated incidents, but are components of a pervasive system of structural violence that defined its governance. Atrocities such as the Opium Wars, the Bengal Famine, and the Amritsar Massacre are interconnected episodes within a continuum of colonial oppression marked by extraction, coercion, and deliberate neglect. Archival documents and recent historical research reveal that these events were not aberrations but deliberate consequences of political and economic policies serving imperial interests. Military force crushed resistance to expand trade monopolies, as in the Opium Wars, establishing profitable narcotics markets through violence. Forced agricultural restructuring and wartime resource diversion precipitated famines, like Bengal's in 1943, where millions perished under colonial indifference and prioritization of British military logistics over indigenous life. Political repression through legalized violence reached brutal peaks with massacres such as Amritsar, where colonial power punished dissent with indiscriminate slaughter, institutionalizing racial hierarchies and civic disenfranchisement. This pattern recurred through the century across various colonies using mass imprisonment, torture, and systemic human rights abuses, documented extensively in reports on Kenya's Moo uprising and concentration camps that left thousands dead. Historical analyses note a repetitive loop in British colonial history. Economic exploitation triggered social crises, which the empire quelled through militarized repression and legal oppression, enabling further extraction. These systemic cycles perpetuated deep social fissures and genocidal outcomes, fully embodying a politics of domination and control justified through racial superiority and imperial prerogative. The final truth reveals an empire sustained by relentless extraction and violent enforcement, indifferent to native lives and welfare. Imperial architecture, social order, and political mechanisms all served to entrench this system of domination. The physical ruins and demographic scars are enduring legacies of a colonial order built on structural violence. If you want more raw history without illusions, subscribe.